Let's take a refresher quiz. I like to do this just to keep everybody on their toes. Let's take a look at the answer to this one. The capacity to enter into and understand the emotions of others is called... The preferred word is empathy. There was a time when people used to use the term sympathy, but that term fell into disrepute. Using blank, researchers ask a person to guess whether he or she is communicating with another hidden person or with an unseen machine. Well, you can do this probably by the process of elimination. The Turing test might refer to the Shroud of Turin, and it ends up being the Turing test. Yes, we talked about that at some length. Alfred Turing designed a test in the hopes that if a machine were to pass it, and you didn't know any better, you'd think that that machine were artificially intelligent. The belief that religion should be consistent with reason and evidence is defined as... Yes, you guessed it. Rationalism. The ability to perceive accurately, appraise, and express emotion is called... Think about it for just a moment. Yes, emotional intelligence, all based on your book. Everybody has been taught that good communication skills are important for a variety of different purposes. We will be discussing in more detail, by the way, out of the little blue book that I wrote, communication theory. So it is important to recognize that we have a couple of different ones, one of which is kind of like a cybernetic one, and perhaps you believe this too. There's a sense in which we tend to digitize human communication, and somehow, often, I've heard people use the model of transmitter and receiver, and channel, and noise. Maybe that's the way communication takes place between humans, maybe not. But one thing for sure, communication is important to critical thinking and decision-making, and there are many different things that you need to consider when you're undertaking to try to communicate a message to someone. And I hope you'll bear some of these things in mind when you take a look in a Blackboard course at President JFK's 1961 inaugural address, thought by many for many decades to have been a very powerful speech motivating the United States, among other things, to get more deeply involved in putting people on the moon, which it appears to have had that motivational capability. Try to keep avenues of communication open, be clear, accurate, watch out for word usage, develop awareness of your language use and that of others, and kind of evaluate people's communication styles as well. We all have a slightly different communication style, and we can all learn from each other. When you think of language as a system of communication with what are called arbitrary symbols, meaning that they're not natural, they're conventional, that we agree upon them, these can be spoken, written, nonverbal. Obviously, you have studied, I'm sure, the notion of cuneiform, hieroglyphics, various kinds of imagistic writing, and right down to the modern alphabet, which, by the way, has been contributed to by many, many cultures. And most people seem to agree that the Greeks were the ones about the 7th, 6th century BC, I believe, maybe a little bit before that, who actually codified the use of what we now know as the alphabet. By creating a shared reality among people, language is the primary means of transmitting cultural concepts, traditions, including critical thinking skills. So language does help to develop a sense of what our world is like, and we're going to explore that concept a little bit more when we also explore the notion of what you see and how you see it and how you're constructed to see it next time. What are some of the functions of language? Well, communication is one thing. The idea of trying to help another person understand what you're talking about, perhaps by planting an idea you have in your mind in somebody else's mind. That's one very naive way of looking at a basic function of language. Language also serves to direct or influence actions, as you will see, I think, in most political speeches. Expressive language, the idea that feelings are communicated, and ceremonial language. And that is used, of course, in situations such as when somebody gets married. And sometimes you see these multiple functions that are all put together. Obviously, language, when used effectively to convey communication, provide direction, and express feelings, becomes an essential aspect of critical thinking, particularly when you're collaborating in your group activity. And I think what I've seen, and I'm very happy that I've seen it amongst you the past couple of weeks when you've gotten together, is that you do tend to take notes, and you do tend to communicate reasonably well with yourselves and with the class at large. It's important to understand that while language greatly enriches our communication of ideas, it can also cause ambiguity and misunderstanding. A good deal of our book is about fallacies and the avoidance of fallacies, and one of the things I want you to take a look at is a little tidbit on rhetorical devices I put up in week 4 of our course. Intellectual curiosity, awareness of other people's language use, are critical thinking skills. Almost any form of curiosity is a potential function of what it means to be a good critical thinker. There is such a thing, of course, as body language or nonverbal language, and vocal tone, intonation, how a person inflects his or her speech with certain kinds of emotion. You can read a sentence in a variety of different ways and just simply read it with different emotional impact, and you will get an entirely different impact or result on the person or the audience listening to it. I'm going to see if this link is still active. The reason I brought this up was because I thought subliminal advertising, of course, is kind of important. And when you see this PowerPoint from a standalone point of view, you can go to this particular website and take a look at it on your own. Let's take a look for just a moment. Aha! That is called subliminal advertising, and we are going to deal with subliminal advertising when we take a look at some of the magazine articles that I'm going to have you bring in. These are relatively older advertisements, but notice that this gentleman appears to be gripping something, and one doesn't necessarily want to disclose that which he is gripping, but it could be that this has been a digitally rendered picture that has a phallus in it. I don't like to dwell too terribly much on this stuff. Actually, it kind of embarrasses me. You know, sometimes when you bring it to people's attention, they think that you're a little odd or off because of the fact that you're finding these hidden messages. But once again, if you take a very close look at much of the subliminal advertising, it has to do with sex. It has to do with the placement of quote-unquote body parts and things like that. So it's probably something that one should, at the very least, be very much aware of. That noise was the courtesy of my colleague, so I hope you enjoy that. So I'll stop it right there. You get the idea. I'd like you to pursue this link and just take a good look at what we're talking about there.
You should put a sign there, like in production,
So now that I got lectured, I'll get back to what we were talking about here. Nonverbal cues, particularly those that for some reason have a oftentimes libidinous sexual connotation associated with them, reinforce what kind of communication is going on, either imagistically, in terms of pictures and videos, or verbal communication. If you're a good critical thinker, you probably know that choosing the right words at the right time and the appropriate nonverbal cues and body language can influence how you are being interpreted, or for that matter, misinterpreted. So it's always good to have the appropriate, I think as a psychologist might say, affect when you're attempting to communicate in a specific environment to an identified audience. Think about the things that might help you communicate. Communicating clearly, and being conscious of the complexity of our language, or any language. Being willing to ask people for clarification. That's an important thing that Socrates, whom we discussed very briefly, and any of his colleagues would have done. Ask for concept clarification. Since we're principally using English, you know, we are talking primarily about our mode of communication, but it's just as true of other languages as well. Certainly those with which I'm somewhat familiar, such as Spanish, and I'm not a terribly good speaker of it, but I do understand it. Greek, Latin, those are the kinds of languages too. Old Greek, ancient Greek, and classical Latin, those are dead languages. But still, for a period of time while they're alive, they were in a quote-unquote dynamic state. And so languages like English, French, Spanish, German are alive, and they change, and so word meanings change, and it's important to remember that. Meaning something like this, that it's possible for a really, really old dictionary to actually be wrong about the current meaning of a word, interestingly enough. Two things, two concepts here, very important. Denotation and connotation. We think that words have denotative and connotative meanings, but there may be some cases in which that's not entirely true. You may discover some words don't outright have denotation. My suspicion is most of them have connotation. And of course, a denotative meaning actually has to do with what is being pointed to by a specific word, such as an object, a state of affairs, an event. And of course, what happens is that you mostly have denotative definitions given in some kind of a dictionary definition at first, but some words like the, a, don't specifically seem to have denotative definitions. It's very hard to point to an object and say that is an a, although you can say that is an object. You see what I'm talking about there. Connotation seems to apply to just about every word, and it tends to include certain kinds of things that we often call subjective feelings that might be based on experiences. You know, certain words that have an emotional charge to them. A term like abortion, for example, or murder. Those words tend to be charged with a lot of connotative meaning. You might find certain connotative meanings listed in a dictionary, but you can also perhaps find in regions where people perhaps use language in a specific way that there are different connotations associated with specific words, even if the denotations of those words are, for all practical intents and purposes, the same. Denotation can be called a collection of all those objects to which a term applies. Connotation is a collection of attributes shared by all and only those objects in a term's quote-unquote extension. So if you think about it, a skyscraper is a building that stands over a certain height. That would be a connotation, and yet the denotation would actually be the skyscrapers that are literally picked out by the term skyscraper. It's very good to remember the kinds of definitions that, generally speaking, there are more, but these are basic ones, the four major ones, that might help you when you're writing a report or trying to persuade somebody of the truth of the logic or the logicality, so to speak, and the truth of what you're arguing. Stipulative definitions are basically brand new terms you might make up. Lexical definitions are those which you find literally in a lexicon or in a dictionary. Precising definitions generally are those that are used to reduce vagueness, and they involve the two subsets, theoretical and operational. Theoretical definition might be something like force equals mass times acceleration, as you'd find in Newton's laws. An operational definition might have something to do with things such as defining blindness or drunkenness in a certain way. Usually it would be construed to be an operational definition if you used the rather legalese and official notion of drunk, which is to say drunk means having an alcohol, blood alcohol content of such and such. That would be operational. Persuasive definitions generally are used to influence, and sometimes they go awry because they influence people for the wrong reasons. An example, stipulative definition, the result of a tiger and a lion mating together, as happened a couple of times now in zoos, is called a liger. That is stipulating or laying out the definition. A lexical definition, a classical case of a lexical definition is, for example, a hammer is a tool used for pounding. Or blind means unable to see. Or drunk means to be inebriated, in which case the lexical definition might actually be giving a synonym. Precising. Taking a similar term, legally blind means having vision of 400/20. Legally drunk means having a blood alcohol content of such and such. Notice that in one case drunk is a fairly ordinarily common sense term, but legally drunk does have more precision associated with it. And perhaps somebody is arguing against capital punishment that might adopt the persuasive definition that it is a barbaric practice of sentencing a criminal to death, or that national health care is a form of left-wing socialism. Those are persuasive, those are biased definitions, and it's important to avoid that kind of persuasive definition. Don't start with that. Start with an objective, precising, lexical, stipulative, or operational definition, and then create an argument around a term such as that. When you're evaluating word definitions, you want to make sure that some definition a person gives you of a specific state of affairs or a concept is neither too broad nor too narrow. A good definition, that is to say a lexical type definition, should give the essential attributes of whatever it is defined. A hammer is a tool specifically used for the following. Good definitions are not circular. A hammer is merely a hammer. That would be obviously logical, but it's and true, mind you, but doesn't tell you very much information, which is why it begs the question or is redundant. Good definitions avoid obscure and figurative language. Like poetry, for example, the emotion of love is a divinely inspired state of ecstasy, which could perhaps also be an emotive way as well. But think about obscure and figurative language. When you're talking about love per se, from the point of view, let's say, of a scientist, you're going to give a theoretical or precising definition. If you're talking about it perhaps somewhat more figuratively, then you're probably not going to give the specific definition. You might end up making something up. It sounds really nice. And there's nobody that is going to say you shouldn't do that, but it just depends on what you're attempting to do. If you're trying to be clear in your expression, then it's an important idea to avoid obscurity and too much metaphor in language. If you're going to be a good critical thinker, which we know that everybody in our class is aspiring to be, there certainly are differences in individual as well as in group communication styles. And this is what I want you to kind of take a look at when you're looking at the JFK inaugural speech. Was he an assertive communicator? Was he an aggressive communicator? Was he a passive communicator? Was he a passive-aggressive communicator? You've probably all been around people who are very assertive, but normally an assertive communicator does express his or herself clearly, but also tries to pay good attention to what other people are saying and allows them to be assertive. On the other hand, somebody who's somewhat more aggressive may actually be trying to manipulate other people and control them. Someone who's passive, and sometimes a good idea to be that on occasion, avoid confrontation and might have some other associated character traits. Passive-aggressive communicators don't seek out direct confrontation, but frequently use methods to get their own way. In other words, they'll say yes when they mean no. They'll simply agree with you just to avoid confrontation, but eventually get back to a position in which what they want to do is to control and manipulate. We see a lot of this again in advertising and marketing. Gender, ethnicity, culture, dress, all of these things influence communication styles, and I'm sure that you've been exposed to them in your own life experience. We know that language can be used to deceive. Sometimes it's deliberate, sometimes it's indeliberate. But the primary cognitive function of language is to inform. When manipulation does occur, it occurs through emotive language, rhetorical devices, and deliberate deception. And I have a separate presentation on rhetorical devices that I put up in Week 4 folder, so please feel free to go through that, and please notice that what I put up there, if you wanted to, could be downloaded onto an MP3 player, and at least on your computer, and listened to later as simply an audio file. Emotive language tries to elicit, evoke emotional impact. Could be positive, could be negative. And what happens is, if we're trying to be very cognitive and informational and factual, emotive language can actually interfere with finding the truth. It can slant it. It could obscure our ability to be able to figure out what in fact is supposed to be going on or what we should be believing. Rhetorical devices use psychological persuasion. And some of them are things like euphemism, dysphemism, sarcasm, hyperbole. Let's take a look at those in some detail. A euphemism is basically a replacement of a negative term with a neutral or positive term. We encountered that quite recently, as some of you probably are aware of, in the Cal State University system and through the state of California. We were placed on furlough days. A furlough seems like a harmless little word. In this context, it's a euphemism for essentially being laid off every other week and not getting paid. Dysphemisms are quite the contrary to euphemisms. They use negative terms to produce negative effects. And they're generally used in straw man arguments in order to win over a group, and sometimes end up alienating others. And I think the current debate that you're hearing in the news about religion has a lot of dysphemisms in it. But when we also have talked in national public dialogue about healthcare Some people define it already with emotive language and thus come to the point where it's almost dysphemistic. National health care is a socialist manifesto. It is the work of evil. It would be better to take a look at the cognitive informational impact and just try to characterize national health care objectively, as opposed to either euphemistically or dysphemistically. When we use ridicule and insult people, taunt them, we're generally engaging in a form of sarcasm, and it deflects our attention away from critical analysis. Hyperbole is exaggeration, overstatement, the distortion of facts. I challenge you to listen carefully to any speech, and any speech is given to a large audience. You're going to discover, I think, given by a politician, a lot of these things we're talking about, including hyperbole. It could be that while there is deception in some of these things, with sarcasm, hyperbole, and things like that, it could be the person engaging in those tactics aren't really aware that, in fact, these are nasty little things that they're doing to one another. When you think about the definition of lie, there's a significant amount of intention. The intention to mislead, the intention to misinform is a lie. So if somebody accidentally misinforms you, that is not a lie. A lie is a conscious thing. One would argue that a lie can never be unconscious, except in the sense in which somebody might not have control of their lying. And of course, lies, as we know, can damage trust and derail honest communication. If you find somebody lying, it's probably one of the things that happens with great frequency. It's always a good idea to stand back and try to cross-verify, check information. If you suspect a lie, and try to deal with it objectively. And take a look at nonverbal cues. There's been much research that has been talked about the excessive blinking, twitches, nervous twitches, voice tone pitch, lie detector test. I personally think that there are other ways of detecting lying, and that has to do mostly with this number 2 bulleted item. Verify and check information. Somebody gives you a bit of information. Common sense is a place to start. Your background information that you possess as a human being that has lived on the earth for a period of time. Somebody makes a bold-faced claim, they could believe it, and therefore not necessarily be lying. They could be unintentionally giving you certain kinds of bad information, but it's up to critical thinkers to detect those things. I leave it to you to take a look at this and assess for yourself what language is. We've given you a very simplistic and naive approach. It bears far deeper scrutiny. But thank you very much for joining me. This has been an abbreviated version of what we would have discussed in our class this evening, and I hope it is of some value, and in addition to the other activities, exercises, and little projects and presentations I have in a course. Take care.